Let's start, Lina. Thank you very much. Well, we have Mauricio Moreno here today. Many of you may know Mauricio because in 1996 he was one of the first. He was part of the first group that started the Mexican Federal Electoral Institute, which for the first time was the first non-government organization organizing elections in Mexico, that at the end in 1997, if I'm correct, really brought for the first time, and the PRI lost the majority of the Congress in 1997, and also Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas, the left, won Mexico City back then. Anyway, he's an academic person, and that's the main reason that he's here, but I wanted to bring his experience not only as an academic, but also as a citizen and representing the Mexican citizen, the Mexican people on all these electoral bodies in Mexico. Mauricio has a PhD in political science from the Universidad Complutense in Madrid. He is a professor and he is the Dean of the Division of Public Administration at the Serie, el Centro de Investigación y Docencia Económica en México. He's a member of the National Academy of Science, and he's a member of the Sistema Nacional de Investigadores that probably most people from Mexico know. Not everybody in the United States even will understand what is something like that, like this name. And he has worked in many areas of the public administration. His research has been in many areas of public administration, public policy, local governments, professionalization of the civic service in Mexico, transparency and ethics in the public sector. He has published many books and chapters and articles on the issues of la gestión profesional de los municipios en México, los desafíos del servicio profesional de carrera en México y la transición votada. As you probably know, Merino is an expert on politics, public administration, not only because he was a member of the IFE from 1996 to the year 2003. Probably you know, after the very close election of the year 2006 in Mexico, there was a new electoral reform in the country just recently, trying to more or less manage some of the issues or the problems that we have, or we thought we had during the 2006 presidential election. And he's going to give a talk about the implications of this new electoral reform in Mexico. We are very happy to have you here, Mauricio. You are very welcome to the center, where you're going to be a fellow for the rest of this month.
No, thank you very much. And I feel a little weird speaking in English with so many people, Mexican around here, and who understands Spanish, but this is the deal, to give this seminar in English. I hope you will understand my Spanglish for the rest of this presentation. And really, thank you very much, Chris. Thank you very much, Rene, for the invitation. Really, I appreciate it very much, because not only the beautiful place where we are, but the beautiful people.
That's the best part.
We are. No, really, thank you very much, and I'm sure that I will be, and my family as well, because I take my family with me. We will take a beautiful 5 weeks in UCSD. Well, thank you very much. I wrote my paper. I'm trying to avoid the problems of my Spanglish, and I think it's better to follow this paper, and for 2 reasons. The Spanglish is the first, my Spanglish, and the second is the time. I am sure that if I follow this paper, I will take no more than 30 or 40 minutes as much. And to support the paper, I prepared just this morning PowerPoint presentation, just to show the highlights of the ideas that I want to share with you. So if you don't mind, I would like to go to the point. I think that the reform approved the last year in Mexico, the electoral reform, can be read from three different yet complementary planes. And this is the point that I would like to share with you. First is as a fundamental change in the model of competition between political parties, which tries to reduce the influence of money in electoral preferences. Second, as a sequel to the excesses committed in the presence of gaps in the previous legislation and in view of the omissions of electoral authorities in the fulfillment of their attributions. And third, as the beginning, I think this is the most important, of a new cycle in the process of political change in Mexico based on the consolidation of a new three-party regime with citizens of low intensity and public debate of low quality. Let me go into each of these topics. First, from afar, the most important point on the reform, and also the most polemical, is that it forbids political parties and also any other person to buy time on radio or television to broadcast electoral propaganda. Nobody in Mexico can now buy political propaganda in the media without deserving a sanction. From this decision, four others are linked. The first is that parties will have official times reserved by the law in every television channel and radio station to broadcast their propaganda. From the period of candidate selection, the so-called pre-campaigns, and until the campaigns conclude, electoral authorities and parties will be able to use 48 daily minutes in each channel, starting at 6 in the morning and until midnight. 85% of this time will be distributed among parties and 15% will be used by electoral authorities. The 30% of the time assigned to parties, a little over 40 minutes per channel, will be distributed equitable among them all, and the remaining 70% will be distributed in proportion to the results that each one has obtained in the last election for federal deputies. Also in this distribution, electoral authorities will need to look for the best possible balance between station and times of the greatest rating for each political parties. Okay? So they will have to distribute among the parties, I mean the electoral authorities, all the time that the parties will use for the campaigns. And the authorities must do that in order to be the most equitable possible in all the channels, to radio and television, and for all the country. Not only for federal elections, but also for local elections as well. Outside the periods or pre-campaign and campaign, electoral authorities and parties will have 12% of the time reserved for the state, up to 3.6 minutes in each station. Half of this time will be distributed among the parties equally, and the other half will be used by the authorities for information and civic education purposes. The second decision derived from this new model of competition consists of the Federal Institute now becoming the only authority responsible for managing the time that corresponds to the state in radio and television for all electoral purposes in the whole country and all the time. This means that it had to deliver the materials produced to all channels and that it should monitor all transmissions made. This new responsibility entails a new technological and organizational effort, which in addition will involve an expenditure calculated in around $80 million annually. In the third place, the new model gives the IFE the faculty to sanction political parties, media, and even individuals who violate the prohibition of buying or selling propaganda in radio or television. Understood as a new state monopoly, electoral propaganda has remained outside of all transactions of a commercial nature, and the IFE has been invested with the authority to investigate and punish those who trade with any kind of propaganda. The IFE is now able to sanction radio and television stations who sell electoral propaganda with fines that can reach an amount close to $500,000 plus the suspension of their transmissions for up to 36 hours. And the law has also established a specific procedure to solve complaints that any person can present about this prohibition. Finally, to prevent public powers or government, federal, state, or municipal, from using public resources to carry out vile propaganda, the reform also established that during the time that campaigns last, all kinds of governmental publicity will be prohibited as well. And it also prohibited for names, images, voices, or symbols that imply personal promotion of public officers to be included in the social communication that governments divulge. The new model that was established in the reform means, in synthesis, that electoral propaganda won't be the object of any kind of commercial transactions, that it will always be transmitted on the state official times, that only political parties will be able to broadcast it, and the electoral authority will have the power to watch over, must watch over, and punish any violation of these norms. We get to this point. Why? Why we get to this point to build a new monopoly in the broadcast of propaganda? Well, we get to this point because of the excesses committed during the last decade, when more than $1 billion were invested in Mexican electoral campaigns, and nearly 60% of that amount was spent on purchasing radio and television spots. 60% of $1 billion during the last decade. We are this far because just in 2006 electoral campaign more than $350 million were used for this purpose, and because there were more than 281,000 spot broadcasts with money which origin was never clarified. And we have come to this model because during the presidential campaign in 2006, the Entrepreneurial Coordinating Council, Consejo Coordinador Empresarial, and some notable individuals, such as the so-called Dr. Simi, in addition to some unions and ephemeral associations of unknown origins, also bought radio and television times, especially to oppose the candidature of Andrés Manuel López Obrador with campaigns of fear and defamation. Some of the new restrictions of the electoral legislation respond, on the other hand, to omissions committed by the electoral authorities. The best example is perhaps the constitutional prohibition regarding the use of political propaganda to denigrate institutions or slander people. This is about a clear limitation to political parties' freedom of expression, of course, but it tries to mitigate the negative messages that took over the 2000 electoral competition and which, to a large extent, prepared the conflict that would come later. And although this prohibition is valid only for political parties, it has generated broad academic and political debates in Mexico because the new laws grant the IFE's councillors the faculty to decide when a critical or even rough campaign in facing the adversary's positions becomes denigrating or slanderous, a threshold difficult to establish for anyone. This restriction already existed in Mexico electoral legislation since 1996, but it wasn't until 10 years later when it was clearly infringed, while the electoral authorities hesitated between the tutelage of the party's freedom of expression and the fulfillment of these special electoral norms. When the judicial power took a stand regarding later, it was already too late. Thus, the current reform brought this prohibition to the very text of the Constitution with the explicit purpose of preventing from this time forward negative campaigns, which take place in any democratic campaign anyway, from going into open calumny and denigration. On the other hand, the reform also reduced the periods for electoral campaigns and the amounts of public financing destined to political parties. From now on, presidential campaigns will have a maximum duration of 90 days, while intermediate campaigns, where only members of the Cámara de Diputados are chosen, will last 60 days. These campaigns will be preceded by the so-called pre-campaigns, during which every party will select their candidates in terms that will not be allowed to exceed 2/3 of the time spent on campaigns. That is, 60 days to select candidates to the presidency and 40 to select candidates for representatives, for deputies. Before this reform, Mexican electoral processes were the longest lasting in the world, according to the UN, with the exception of those carried out in countries immersed in war conflicts or civil war. The formulas used to assign public financing to political parties also changed. From now on, in order to calculate the ordinary budget that will be handed by these organizations, the number of citizens registered in the electoral census will be multiplied for 65% of the official minimum wage for the federal district. 30% of this amount will be equitably distributed among all the parties, and the other 70% will be assigned according to the votes that each one of them obtained in the last election for federal deputies, the same formula used to distribute the broadcast time in radio and television. In order to finance presidential campaigns, political parties will also receive an amount equivalent to 50% of the usual ordinary funding, and for intermediate campaigns, they will receive 30% of that ordinary amount. The reform, in addition, limited private fundings that parties can receive to a maximum of 10% of the upper limit in expenditure established for campaigns. No more than 10%. It set up new procedures for recording these resources and determined that a single individual could not offer more than 0.5% of the total amount of private contributions to a party. In this sense, the new legislation has underlined the importance of public financing over private money, not only with the purpose of achieving more equitable and better supervised campaigns, but also of preventing the entry of openly illicit resources, and especially from the narco-traffickers. The reform also gave electoral authorities new faculties to supervise and control resources used by the parties. The IFE now has a technical unit specialized in the matter, a unit which is going to supervise the use of the money, which replaces the committee of electoral councillors that carry out this task before this reform. But above all, the new legislation breaks definitely the so-called bank, fiscal, and fiduciary secrets that used to limit the ability of the IFE to investigate. It is the response to other excesses of the past, and especially to those derived from the case known as Amigos de Fox, where the IFE had to face in court the judicial resources that were left against it so as to prevent it from having access to the bank accounts of those who gave resources to the campaign of President Fox. The secret that protected those accounts could only be defeated through judicial orders and after long and tortuous trials. With the current legislation, instead, the IFE will be able to find out about the bank movements of any person, but it will not be able to use this information for any other purpose. That is, it will act in the same manner than a prosecutor does, invested with the authority to investigate possible illicit facts for any person, not only for parties, but for any person, and in any case, which is, I think, a big power to the electoral authority, given to the electoral authority. The new electoral legislation orders as well the opening of parties' public information in equivalent terms to those imposed in other public entities in Mexico. Thanks to the transparency and access to information law. In this sense, political parties will have to place on their internet portals all information about the income they receive, their internal ordinances, their organization structures, the wages assigned to their members, and the financial reports that they present before electoral authorities. And they will be forced to respond to information requests that citizens present to the IFE, insofar as they are not for personal data. I would like to underline the importance of these new disclosure norms, which for sure will become an open resource for electoral dispute in the very near future. In synthesis, the recently approved electoral reform has not only modified the model of electoral competition as I explained before, but it can also be seen as a response to the excesses and omissions that were seen in Mexican electoral contest during the past 10 or 12 years. Thus, there is a reduction of time destined to campaigns, the decrease in public monies that are devoted to them, the transparency or more transparency, the prohibition of black campaigns, and the reinforcement of the IFE's means for investigation to supervise and control the use of money. All these, in my opinion, are the good news about electoral reform. But when I started this conversation, I said that the reform could also be read as the beginning of a new cycle in political change in Mexico based on the consolidation of a new three-party regime with citizens of low intensity and public debate of low quality. After the brief review of the most important points of the electoral reform, let me now explain why I think this third interpretation is also pertinent. In the first place, I want to go over the thesis according to which the process of democratic transition in Mexico was concentrated almost fully on successive electoral reforms that started towards the end of the 70s and which became the key to the change in political regime towards the end of the last century. In other papers, in other opportunities, I have tried to explain that the Mexican transition was a voted one, for there were no ruptures with the political groups that governed the country in the past. There were no foundational agreements that went beyond the limits of electoral competition. Nor were there dramatic institutional transformations at all. Mexico's political change consisted in the gradual linkage of reforms that were always on an electoral nature, which opened new opportunities for political plurality, from municipal governments to the alternation in the Republic's presidency. It was a transition designed to host a new three-party regime which had notable resorts during the 90s. If in 1989 the political regime in Mexico was governed by a single party, there were no opposition in state governments, no opposition in legislative chambers which had a majority, and only 39 out of nearly 2,400 municipalities were governed by other parties in the last of the decade of the 80s. By the year 2000, close to 80% of Mexicans, this is the period, the clue period, close to 80% of Mexicans had already lived with local governments run by the PRI's opposition. More than 500 municipalities were governed by different acronyms. 20 entities had divided governments, and the Cámara de Diputados had majorities different from the president. That same year, 2000, as you know, was the first time that the PRI lost the election for the presidency. But the most important thing, in my opinion, is that that change in the commands of the executive was preceded by plurality that expanded during the previous years, and which by the end of the century was already a reality in the whole country. Three large parties, including the PRI, represented that plurality in all local governments in the country and also in the legislative chambers. And although there was still, and there still is, a small group of another 5 or 6 parties, right now there are 2 more organizations trying to be new parties. The truth is that the new political regime in Mexico revolves around the PAN, the PRI, and the PRD. It was these parties who negotiated the successive reforms, who decided to give themselves broad public financing to sustain their political structures, the ones who gave themselves free access to radio and television and all the means essential to have an equitable competition among them. The 3 large political parties in Mexico were, in sum, the ones who established the party monopoly in political representation and the ones who today have also established the monopoly in propaganda. No other organization can present candidates for positions of popular elections, no can have access for public funding to carry out campaigns, and no can divulge propaganda in pro or against parties in their candidates. And if there is any doubt, in the recently approved electoral reform, it was also prohibited for any union organization, entrepreneurial or any other character to use their membership to form new parties. This is absolutely prohibited. Now, if anyone wants to compete through the electoral route, he needs to start all from zero, recruiting more than 186,000 citizens individually who are required to assist the assemblies in 200 electoral districts in the country, with at least 300 verified attendees in each one, or else to 20 state assemblies with 3,000 attendees. And if they obtain their registry, which is very, very tough task, these recently created parties would have to compete against the largest with diminished resources, prerogatives and times in radio and television, for they would not have access to the proportional distribution of 70% of these political resources. On the other hand, the Mexican electoral system, as you know, is mixed. 300 representatives and 64 senators are elected in districts of electoral majority. Sorry?
No, let me turn this network switch here.
Of electoral majority. But another 200 representatives and 32 senators are elected by proportional representation. This means that the parties with the largest accumulated vote can place their leaders in the first places of the list so as to ensure the entry to the legislative power without being obligated to carry out campaigns. And if we add that in the Mexican electoral system there is no re-election, the specific weight that party leaderships have in Mexico can be better understood, I think. Beyond technicalities, the account is as follows. Only political parties can compete for positions of election. Only they can broadcast propaganda on radio and television. Only they have public resources to finance their political structures, big and bureaucratic structures, and to pay for campaigns expenditures. And because of the proportional representation system, they can gain hold of many positions in the legislative power without go to campaigns. And they do not allow their election that would subject them to the scrutiny of voting in the following electoral round. All this was a product of our voted transition. The electoral reform that I have been talking about tends to consolidate this new regime, not only because of the new monopoly on propaganda that I already explained, but also because the parties have made sure to have electoral authorities selected to take care of the rules that the parties established. In a new twist of the brief history of the IFE, it can be said that starting with the reforms just approved, this institution is now expected to become an agency of administration of the new rules and of management of future electoral processes. Without false expectations, the IFE will no longer be, is my guess, an independent agency to exercise electoral regulation, nor an institution headed by independent citizens to watch over the conduct of political parties and to open the public space to education, debate, and political participation, but rather it is expected to be a professional institution for management and administration of the recently electoral reform. If in 1990 this institution arose as a response to the electoral fraud and conflict of 1988 and to the need to have a space at an efficient and legal time where political parties could watch over the organization of electoral processes and where they could defend themselves from the frauds committed by governments before that year, by 1996 it was thought that the IFE should gain independence both from governments and parties to become an autonomous organ of the Mexican state, a new autonomous organ of the state, led by independent citizens. This organ, renovated in 1996, responded to the assumption of an electoral competition organized, controlled, and watched over citizens themselves. It was even called as la ciudadanización del IFE. If the political system was changing towards a new three-party regime, the IFE was imagined as an institution from which education and civic participation would be enhanced and where citizens could find an institution to participate in. And to a large extent, I think it was so. The IFE not only responded by organizing the elections in 1997, 2000 and 2003, when the whole electoral landscape in Mexico changed, as we saw before, but it also strongly sanctioned the improper use of public and private financing. It generated space where social organization could watch over the elections, and it designed in methods for training and civic education, which at the time influenced the building of trust that Mexicans place on the electoral process. After a few years, the IFE became the public institution that generated the greatest trust among Mexicans. By the year 2001, 8 out of 10 Mexicans declared their trust on the IFE, which they saw accordingly as a space that belonged to citizens. It was not casual either that the UN took the Mexican model, as it was called then, as an example and technical help to contribute to the electoral organization for other countries such as Timor, Peru, South Africa, or Iraq. This all happened within the space of 7 years. But this model of an independent and citizen IFE began to be doubted starting in 2003, when the renovation of the General Council became a dispute among political parties. Legislators from the 3 main parties could not reach an agreement to renovate the General Council, and after breaking off the negotiations, the PAN and the PRI designated the new electoral councillors against the opinion of the PRD. On the other hand, the profiles and biographies of the new members of that organ seemed, I said, to respond more to the confidence that parties that designated them place on them than to the idea of an institution run by members of the civil society, or who at least had links and history that arose from the civic democratic struggle in Mexico or their own presence in the national public debate. Although the new councillors were respectable professionals and some of them had a long career in electoral affairs, the public opinion had a bad reaction to the designations in that year. But the most important thing was the rupture of electoral consensus among the parties in 2003. And in regards to the PRD, it is not too much to remember that even that year it was evident that López Obrador, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, would not only be the candidate to defeat for the presidency, but that he also announced a competed and difficult process, very competed process. So the renovation of the IFE's Council in 2003 without the support of the PRD seemed to announce the beginning of a political conflict that later certainly occurred, as it had been a script followed letter by letter. To this origin marked by disagreement, the General Council kept adding omissions in the exercise of its authority so as to create a climate of doubt and hesitation that fed more and more the arguments of those who saw in the electoral results in 2006 a fraud committed by the party in government and tolerated or even promoted, as PRD is still sustaining, by the IFE itself. After election day on July the 2nd, 2006, the General Council chose to hide the information. It was a bad decision. Chose to hide information it had about electoral tendencies. It made an obvious mistake in its social communication strategy, and in the end it created confusion and delay in the delivery of definitive results. During those hours of uncertainty, the 2 leading candidates, Calderón and López Obrador, proclaimed themselves the winners of the elections, and the country sunk into the greatest political electoral conflict that it had faced since 1988, as you perfectly know. Last year's electoral reforms could not be explained without taking into account that scenario in 2006. And from this, I have to underline the importance that these reforms were voted with the consensus of all parties, finally. After the rupture in 2003, party leaders have managed to rebuild the basic roles to once again organize elections with acceptable results for all of them. Or that's our hope. In this sense, it is no wonder that they preferred an IFE able to maintain the political equilibriums among the parties and to manage the new model of competition on a professional basis than to return to the citizen and independent model that was raised in the second half of the 90s. I am finishing. The bad news is that during this process, the new process of designation of the new councillor, now in the new confirmation of the General Council of the IFE, the bad news is that during this process, it also became clear that citizens lost faith in the decisions of political parties, as well as interest in the future in the IFE. 80% of trust that this institution had accumulated by 2001 became 80% of mistrust in the designations made this year. And under these conditions, the public consultation that the parties called for lost substance. When on December the 13th last year, the party leaders announced that they hadn't reached an agreement and they would postpone their decision to reintegrate the General Council of the IFE, it became clear that the public consult had failed and that it would be with the parties themselves in direct negotiations outside the public opinion who would seek the best possible equilibrium, again, in order to provide confidence to themselves. And that's the way it was. The new electoral councillors who were finally selected beyond their own professional credentials revealed that equilibrium between the three main parties. They are the correct councillors for the model of a professional organization for electoral processes and for the management of the new condition of competitions in harmony with the interest of the parties. In sum, the electoral reform and the IFE's renovation represent the beginning of a new cycle in Mexico's political change. Neither the electoral system nor the authorities that manage it will ever be as they were during the years of transitions. I think this model is broken. That model belongs to the past. Today, instead, we have a new three-party regime that heads towards its consolidation in the long term, and we have the rules and the authorities that correspond to that regime. It is true that it is still a long road for the Mexican public space to belong, in effect, to citizens. This is, I think, the great deficit from our transition to democratic plurality. But to speak about the public space, the capture of the public space in Mexico, will take another conversation, and I have already extended too much myself. So this is my presentation, and I'm ready to talk with you about it. Thank you very much for hearing my paper.
Scott?
Professor, thanks for your very interesting talk. I'm Scott Desposado from Political Science, former U.S.-Mexico fellow. I have two questions, two things I think are kind of interesting. The first is, you said that the three major parties passed this reform with a great deal of support. Was there sort of any significant differences among the parties? Was the PON a little less supportive? Was the PRD more supportive? I only ask that because in the last election, the PON benefited from this aggressive, nasty campaign strategy, and it worked, right? And so I'm a little surprised that they would vote for a reform. And second, the model that Mexico has adopted is fairly similar to Brazil's model. Every channel, certain hours, has political advertisements and so on. And there's also penalties for defamation. One of the apparent costs of that is that there's research that says that negative advertisements have more information than positive advertisements. So if you recall, López Obrador, one of his most popular ads was the one where he said, humano, amigo, mexicano. It was just all emotional. And one of the most famous Calderón ads that was negative was the, how did López Obrador pay for this new road? He went into debt, he tripled, and there's lots of substantive information. So I wonder what you think about the potential cost to the, what was the real, maybe the real right way to ask this is, what was the real goal? Was it just to make things different, or was there an idea that campaigns shouldn't be like this?
Should I answer it?
Yeah, I think go ahead.
Yes.
I will jump to Colef to see if they have a question.
Okay, Scott, thank you. So I go
ahead, yeah.
to the answer. Scott, thank you very much. I think that we have to remember that the difference between PAN and PRD in the last election was nothing, no? And Felipe Calderón needed to get legitimacy, no? It's like the 1988 when Carlos Salinas was in a very similar position, very similar situation, who pushed him to try to get legitimacy, well, by other ways. But it is not too much to remember that precisely the IFE born in 1990, 2 years after the election of 1988. No, it was the first decision, one of the first decisions to get legitimacy. I can't say legitimacy in that section. Now I think that Felipe Calderón was forced to do a similar agreement with the parties, no? And to get back, to try to return the PRD to the table, to the negotiations. And of course the first issue for PRD was the change of the General Council of the IFE. As a matter of fact, the General Council should be there for 9 years, no? Well, it was a negotiation who decided to cancel the contract, to despedir, to fire out Luis Carlos Ugalde, no, as you remember. That was the first step of that negotiation, and after that negotiation, the PRD came back to the table, so to say, the political table, to go on with this electoral reform. So I think it is possible. You're right. I mean, you're perfectly right. The statu quo was preferable to the PAN, but I mean the electoral statu quo. But they need very hard to find out how to negotiate with the opposition and to take a new route, not to keep going with the polarization of the political system. No? And I have to say that, perhaps you know that in the final of 2006, we really had a conflict, a very big conflict in Mexico, and the polarization was not only in the political spheres, but into the families, no, and schools, and it was really hard, no. And I think the situation, the circumstances, was the answer, no, to your question. And well, in politics, this used to happen. No, the rationality of the decisions are not on the decision itself, but on the circumstances in which you have to take those decisions. No? We were talking just a few minutes about the problem to make decisions, and I think that in politics the circumstance is always, I said, more important than the question that you have to decision on. No, I think this is to discuss another kind of philosophical point. But I think this is the answer. And on the other way, yes, one of the most polemical points of the electoral reform is still the prohibition to negative campaigns. And as you said before, yes, we can say that the negative campaigns are important to inform the citizens how to vote. No? I think this is very important, and I agree with that. The problem was the excess. And the problem was, I mean, how to manage with the result of the 2006 conflict. I will return to this idea, which I try to point in my paper. If you don't see the conflicts that we had to face, I mean the country, no? In 2006, you cannot understand the bias of the electoral reform that is just a proof. It's really the answer, in many ways, to those excesses and omissions in the electoral campaign of 2006. And perhaps when we get calm, no, and if we return to a new routine of well-organized elections, well, this point about the negative campaigns is going to be excluded again. No? But now it was important to get a negotiation again.
Thank you. Let's take a question from Colef, Lina.
Yes, Laura.
I guess I'll do it in English, although it's a bit awkward to talk to my
Thank you.
in English, but anyway. He has just given us very somber forecast for Mexican electoral politics, to say the least. And I guess there are 2 points. One is we're going to face, he says, a very stable three-party system. And we can discuss if that's good or bad. Many established democracies have stable 2- or 3-party systems. What's really worrisome, I think, is that the IFE, Autonomous Institute, has become an agent, not to say hostage, of political parties. And what I would like to ask Mauricio is, which 3 specific institutional reforms could you suggest to fix this? And who you think are the most likely players or the most likely actors, independent candidates, smaller parties, social organizations, I don't know, who could take these reforms to the political arena?
3. You asked for 3 suggestions?
Yes.
I heard correct?
Yes.
Why not 5?
Because I know you could go forever. Thank you.
I could, okay. I believe very strongly that there was a project, and as you can see, and I think that you can understand this perfectly, I insist that it was a project to build an IFE which could be the door to a new conception of the public space in Mexico. I know that we are talking about an electoral reform, but I think it is important to try to explain this as well as a capture of the public space in terms of the political representation in Mexico. It is captured, it is kidnapped by the parties. And it is a big problem because the parties are not only, of course they are citizens organizations, I know that, but the problem is the way they are organized. They are not only very hierarchical, as perfectly we know since Michels or since Mosca, or it is not only a theoretical problem, it's a bureaucratic problem. They have a lot of money, they have the monopoly of the political representation, now they have a new monopoly of the political propaganda, and they have the way to be there for many years. Of course, the interest is to stay there as long as they can. It's a problem of power. I cannot ask for them to change their minds in order to be good people, good guys. No? They are trying to get power, and they are getting that power as well. No? That's my point, Laura. So the reform that, the technicalities that you probably are asking for me, it's difficult to answer with that technical punctuality, because I was talking about a bigger thing, no? The public space capture. Okay. Now, any kind of reform from now on, I think that must be based on this perception of the kidnapped public space. For example, I think that the social organizations must be supported as well as the parties. Why not? The public financing is only for the bureaucratic structures of the parties, but we have not a contrapeso, a balance with the social organization as a whole. We have not even the possibility to organize agrupaciones políticas nacionales. As a matter of fact, the APNs were a good figure, to organize citizens around issues, around political causas políticas, but they practically disappear from the electoral reform after this negotiation. So we need to reinforce this, I think, with the idea to have a new public space in Mexico that now is absolutely kidnapped for the political parties. And of course we have to go back to some issues like the negative campaigns, which I think is important right now to send a message. I explained it before, but of course I think as well that we have to go back to the situation in which everybody can say whatever they want to try to win votes, for example. I don't know if I answering you, Laura, but that's my reaction to your position.
Yeah. We can take another question from Colef.
Yes, thank you. We have
another
another
question
one.
Or comment?
Yes, we have another one. Sara Martinez.
Yeah, okay, go ahead.
Hi, Mauricio.
Hola.
It's nice to see you again, even if you are rather far. But it's just taking the point you're talking about. And I think it's very interesting to talk about some political arenas which go beyond elections, because, well, seeing it from an economist's point of view, which is mine, I guess for me it keeps power too locked to certain processes.
If you can speak a little slowly, please, because I'm having problems to understand.
Okay.
Sorry me.
So what I'd like to know is if you can take your discussion a little beyond what we are talking about, which is elections mainly, and the electoral system. And it's, I'm grabbing this question from the answer you gave to Laura, basically. And I'd like to know if you think that political space is working in the same way when we talk about policies and the process we are seeing in Mexico of decentralization of other things that go to state level. And my question comes from the fact that I think that parties are becoming very, very strong and controlling certain points from states now, not from the Congress itself.
Yes.
So I'd like to know, how do you think this political arena is going, well, kind of dripping down to the other government levels too?
Yes, that's a very interesting question, I think. I know that we are here speaking about the electoral reform and trying to explain what was about it, no? The electoral reform, I mean. But I insist that to change this situation in which we are, I think that we have to move out of the electoral sphere. In my book, no, in La Transición Votada, I already said that the voted transition was a mistake because everything was based on the electoral reforms, one by one, expecting that the electoral way should be enough to change the Mexican system to a democratic one. And I thought, and I still thinking, that it was a mistake. And the problem is that we are making this mistake once and
Again.
and again and again. No, I think we have to move out of the electoral sphere for a while, at least. Probably we have to return later to try to fix the mistakes that we are committing right now, no, with this last reform. But that would be technicalities. But if we move out of the electoral sphere, we can talk about a more strong democratic process. I mean, we have to talk about the changes in the accountability system. To have, I always try to explain that to have an accountability system, first you need to have accounts, ¿no? Para tener sistema de accountability, you have to register the public expenditures, for instance, and we have not that kind of register of public expenditures. To have an information access, you need to have archives. You need to have the things that people can ask for, etc. But I think that there is a kind of a thing, a concept. I don't want to appear frivolo, no, with the words, but my point is that we need a kind of fontanería democrática. I don't know how to say it in English, no?
I don't know. Fontanería is like, what with the tubes there? Plumber in there.
Well, I will ask here if anybody suggests a kind of translation of fontanería, but we need that, you know, and the problem is that with the transition to plurality, we now get a new regime, without any doubt. We have a new regime, of course. This is a new regime. This is a very different system that we had before, of course. It's a new plurality in Mexico, but not necessarily we have a bigger public space. And this is not only for political participation, but as well for the media, for example, for the public debate. The problem, or one of the problems of this electoral reform, is the struggle of the media against it, because we have two owners, as you know, Televisa and TV Azteca, and of course they are absolutely against the electoral reform because they are trying to get their interest, their financial, economic interest. But if we would have a bigger public space in the media, probably we were discussing another kind of issues, and not only this. But you can say the same in the market. The market in Mexico is as well captured, kidnapped for 10 people. And I mean it. It's not an exaggeration. It's 10 people who gets the 40% of the total amount of our Bolsa de Valores. I mean, so we need a bigger public space. And I think that to change the electoral issues, we have to go better to other spheres to reinforce democratic process, democratic participation, public space, and then to balance the power of the political parties. And I can say the same, and as you know perfectly, in the municipal level and the state level, of course, for many years, but I'm not going to go to that issue because I could be here for 2 hours more. It's my favorite. No?
Okay. Let's take a question or comment here. Yes, please.
Professor Maynard, I have a question about the relationship between congressmen and constituency, I mean voters. I want to know if this electoral reform is going to affect the relationship between congressmen and constituency, because during all the Mexican system we know that legislators were worried about the president, what the president is thinking about is going to control my political future. I want to know if with this electoral reform we can expect a more democratic relationship between legislators and constituency, that the legislator will be more worried about what my constituency is thinking in order to advance in my political career. We can expect a better relationship, a more democratic relationship between legislators and voters, or this electoral reform is not going to affect this relationship?
I believe that this electoral reform in particular it has not concern about that issue. I mean, the plurality is probably the answer, no? In the ancien regime, no? You were right. The president was as well the head and the slave of his party. No? To be the head, to be the real head, he must to be the slave, el esclavo of his party. It was a double position. No? I lead, but I obey at the same time. Of course, the constituency was not a matter in those conditions. No. Now it is more important the relation between the congressman and all the elected charges in Mexico than before, but not because this reform, but because the relation of the parties, the three main parties, with the elections as a whole. They are competing always for votes. The Mexican political sphere is always linked with the next election. No, as you know, it's very difficult to have a good bargain, to have a good negotiation, to have a good reform on, I don't know, fiscal or energy or labor or anything you want to say, because the next election is going first, no, and the parties are struggling among them to try to get the votes. Of course, this is good news, in my opinion, to get a more close relation between constituency and the congressman. But on the other hand, you have the bureaucracies, as I said before, and you have the hierarchical organization of the parties, and you have the power of the leaders of each party all the time. And you have not re-election, and this, I think this is very important point to have a better relation with the constituency, and you have not public debate, or it's a very low quality debate, and you have no social organizations which can balance the power of the party. So without those conditions, they can do anything they want, I think.
For a long time I've been kind of struggling, trying to understand why López Obrador really is still fighting for the PRD when he never liked the PRD. He always blamed the PRD for whatever happened in the 2006 election. But I think after your presentation it's very clear why he's going to fight to be the head of the PRD.
Yes.
As long as possible, because
yes,
moving to a smaller party or trying to build a new one is going to be very, very difficult. So the struggle there is going to be for a long time before he really resigns and try to do something else. But one of the major reactions to the new electoral reform was all these intellectuals in Mexico that basically were fighting that this was not against the Constitution because of freedom of speech, because this was not really granted to any citizen to really to speak about what, or organization to speak about what they think about, you know, the left, the right ideology, policies in Mexico. What is your take on that? I mean,
yes,
is that really something that, even if now we are not seeing the electoral reform functioning until next year, yes, when we have the election, what is your take on this?
I think there is a technicality that I have to explain before. No, the answer. The technicality is the prohibition is only against the parties. I mean, the parties, no, against the other parties. The absolute prohibition to the free speech, to the free expression. Free expression is the way to say it, no? Is against the parties, not against anyone else. I mean, I, for example, write my weekly article to one newspaper in Mexico. I will say, I can say everything, anything I wish, and nobody can stop my liberty, my freedom of expression. No? The point is with the parties, and in the parties the prohibition is only in case of denigration of institutions and people. No, that's only the point. So I think it is important to distinguish this thing, because some intellectuals in effect are saying that free expression is now prohibited in Mexico as a whole, and that is not the truth. No, the electoral reform is not in that.
So if the private sector wants to run a campaign like in 2006 against López Obrador, can they do it?
No, they can say anything they want, and I'm sure they will. No, but they cannot buy the time in radio and television to broadcast that opinion. This is the second prohibition.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which is what people is relating to freedom of expression.
Which is related, I mean, I think, not only to freedom of expression, but especially to the money of the TV enterprises.
That's true.
So I think it's important to understand this technicality.
Oh, yeah, you're right.
Because I'm not sure that people is really fighting against or in favor of the freedom of expression, or are fighting against the possibility of lose money. No, I think this is, to distinguish this, I think is very important. Now, nevertheless, you could say, you can say, ¿cómo se dice? Podrás decir, you can say anything you wish in the next campaign. The prohibition is to buy time in radio or television to broadcast that opinion. But you can call for press conferences, or you can organize seminars, or anything you want.
So you want to add something on this?
I was going to say, what about newspaper advertisements?
The professor, or I mean...
Yeah, I just wanted to take, because if it was on this...
Just a thought. Can they buy newspaper
sorry.
advertisements?
Sorry?
Can business people buy newspaper advertisements to state their opinion? Or the prohibition?
No, it's just for radio and television.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry, Harrison.
Thanks. Harrison Gray from the Institute of Americas. As you mentioned, one of the biggest problems we have in Mexico is that we have gone from public monopolies to private monopolies, union monopolies. The monopoly is a big problem. And now we have another monopoly.
Yes.
And we're losing that public space. So how do you construct a civil society that is participatory? Because without the civil society, we have no democracy. It doesn't seem to exist in Mexico anymore. Maybe it never existed.
Oh my God. It's like the question of Laura, no? If Laura is still there, no? Probably she can help me, because I have no idea, a specific idea, no? But I do agree. I insist, no? What exactly to do? What kind of specific reform we have to manage to build a new public space is a very complicated thing to answer, no? Probably there is a new investigation issue for us, no? And I think there is a line of investigation to research on, no? But you're right. My point before that was the IFE was expected to be a kind of leader, of institution, which going to leader to going through that public space, trying to get the citizens in. No, that was one of the most important things to do in the IFE. I can say it with absolutely security, no? But with these changes, the parties get back and decided to get out the IFE of that sphere. That's my point. The IFE is not longer be, and I firmly are saying this, we have to understand that the IFE is not going to be the space for the citizens anymore, because the IFE has to be a new management professional agency to go on with the obligations of this electoral reform. The nature of the institution, of the electoral institution, had changed, and this is very important to understand. I think the things to be done in the future. No? So we have to imagine another place to work on in that point. No? But I have not a specific, punctually answer for your toughly question. No?
Mauricio, one question. I'm not sure if it's accurate, this question, but is there any regulation related with broadcasting from abroad? Because more and more people are watching.
Yes, it is prohibited. I can answer this directly. It is prohibited. You cannot buy any kind of broadcast from United States, for example, to send it to Mexico. If anybody tries to do that, the IFE must to go to an investigation and to sanction that attitude, that fact.
That holds for both parties and the private, people in the private sector?
Yes, absolutely. The prohibition is absolutely for everybody. For everybody. When I talk about a monopoly, I'm not joking. No, it is a new monopoly of the propaganda. The monopoly is it's like every other monopoly.
How about the internet?
Nobody can buy or get into the propaganda.
And the internet?
That's a big problem for the IFE. Yes, of course. The internet and many other ways too. The IFE and the phones, no? For example, the election in Spain changed, no? As you remember, I mean, Zapatero won the election after the explosion, no, in Madrid, in Atocha. And they say that the very main influence to change the vote was the message, the cellular message, no? That in 2 days changed the mind of too many people, and Zapatero won the election, no? And of course Aznar lost. No, you're right. The electoral reform has silent about that issues, and the IFE has to tell us how to deal with these new technologies, no? But it is not exactly established in the reform. The IFE has the authority to decide about it.
Fernando?
Yeah, I was going to ask you a similar question about the civil society, but I'm going to narrow it down a little bit, which is, I was going to basically ask or comment that maybe other sources of media will become more important, especially those that are, that have a visual and stimuli, because, newspapers, that's why the reform focused on TV and radio for the most part, because that's the media that people use for the most part. The majority of the Mexican population.
Yes.
And then because it would have been really contentious, I think, to do that with newspapers, or even impossible perhaps. But even more difficult to regulate the internet. Nobody can really regulate the internet.
Or the cellular phone.
Nobody has. Yeah.
Yes.
So I guess my question would be related to, well, do you think that, say, these other sources of, these other media would be used by both parties and civil society? And if so, and also if you see any loopholes in this law regarding even broadcasting messages by radio and TV, because you cannot promote or speak against the campaign of a specific candidate, but can you bring up issues? For instance, there's advertisements here in the U.S. Talking about it's time that Congress sits down and fixes the health system. Can people do that in Mexico? Do you think this would be a new issue-based type of propaganda that maybe would, well, on the one hand would be like a very indirect way to slander a candidate, but on the other it could bring actual issues to the table? Or am I just being too naive here?
No, you're right. No, not naive, absolutely, no. You're right. On the contrary, I think that the next year we will see a very
a lot of creativity.
That's it. And not only to go against the law, but to create new ways to to say what people want to say against and in favor of the candidates. I think the naive thing is this reform, no, that prohibits everything. No, it is quite impossible to do that. Anyway, I think also that it has good news, which are the the possibility for the parties to get time in radio and television to broadcast their messages. If I had to choose, I choose that, to get, to conserve, to maintain the distribution of free access to radio and television, and to get out the problem of the absolute prohibition for everybody. No, I think this is a very good mixture. The free access for parties to radio and TV, and the regulation to access for other people who wants to get into the campaigns. I mean, it is a kind of aportaciones, I lose the word, contributions to the campaigns, and I think it is perfectly possible to regulate that kinds of contributions in spaces, no? When you buy time in radio and television, you are contributing to a campaign. I think it is possible, but it will be possible after the next election, when all the things you are referring absolutely will happen, and the congressmen notice that they have to change again these electoral rules, I'm afraid.